Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Ask 5. My name is Monica Molinaro, and I'm your host. And today I'm joined by Terkuma. Thanks so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. Before we get started, though, would you mind introducing yourself to our audience?
Okay, I'm Terkuma Chia. I'm a PhD student at the Institute of Health Sciences Education at McGill University.
Perfect. Thank you so much for joining me. And before we dive into what our five had to say, do you mind introducing the question that they had to answer for this episode?
Okay, so our topic for today is what are the important but maybe unexpected skills I should have as a researcher?
Definitely an important question.
Yeah.
Definitely something that I think you learn more about over time through grad school and moving forward from that. So how about we introduce our five and see what they had to say about this question?
Okay.
Meredith Young. I'm an associate professor at the Institute for Health Sciences Education at McGill University in Montreal, Canada.
I'm Elizabeth Ann Kinsella, and I am director and professor at the Institute of Health Sciences Education in the Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences at McGill University.
Lesley Fellows. I'm a professor of neurology and neurosurgery at McGill, a neurologist, and the dean of the Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences.
So today I'm joined by...
I'm Stuart Lebarski. I'm a neurologist. I do general neurology at the Montreal General Hospital, and I'm also associated with the Institute of Health Sciences Education, where I'm a faculty member.
Suzanne Mack, Occupational Therapy Program at the School of Physical and Occupational Therapy and member of the Institute of Health Sciences Education at McGill University.
What are important but maybe unexpected skills to have or develop as a researcher?
So the funny thing is we get trained very specifically to do research, and then the active designing of studies, collecting of data, interpreting findings is solid 15% of what we do. Because we teach and we do administration and we do all these other things, and some people have clinical practices or other jobs and other lives. But I've found two things to be really important for me in kind of looking back as to how I've kind of found my space and found a way to be in the research context. One is listening, but really listening, the kind of listening that makes you tired at the end. Because I find what other people do for their research is really interesting, and really trying to understand why that person finds that interesting or why that problem is super cool and really needs to be addressed. And it helps because I learn a lot, but it also helps me really understand that person's scholarship. And that's helpful for a couple reasons. Because later on, if someone talks about something similar, I could be like, oh, have you talked to Monica? What you're talking about is really similar to what she's talking about. And I think you guys could have a cool conversation. So it helps me connect other people, helps me with my own learning, which is totally selfish. And then it also helps me kind of build a mental Rolodex. So if I have questions or if I'm trying to understand something, I can ask that person. And sometimes I find the way that people think really, really fascinating. And it takes me a long time to figure out if there's a project I could work on with them. But there's been a few people in the community that I've really liked the way they've thought. And it's taken us years and years and years to find something to work on. But I've learned a ton from those experiences. So listening is super important, but really listening. Which means you also care what the person's saying, which is also important. And linked to that is just curiosity. I'm reading all kinds of things and listening to books and podcasts and learning about what other people are doing. And I think being authentically curious, and I guess that links to good conversations too, helps me stay interested in my own work and in my own space in the community. But also gives me very different perspectives to problems. And I can never really tell when different ideas are going to connect, but when they do, it's really cool. And it's really good. So those two skills, learning how to listen well, and honestly keeping a really broad scope in terms of what you find interesting, have been surprisingly generative and important.
This is an easy one for me because I think it was a shock to me to discover how important the skill of writing is. If there's anything that I would say to a new researcher is to translate your research, we tend to do it in writing. And so we write manuscripts and we write and we write and we write. We write dissertations. It's 300 pages of expressing the work that you're doing. So if there was one thing that I would say to anybody who is undertaking a career as a researcher, it is invest equally in your writing skills and your writing capacities. There's a really great book that has been published recently by Lorelei Lingard and Chris Watling called Story, Not Study. And their book talks about how important it is to tell the story of your research. And I think it's key in terms of sharing the work that you're doing, but also making an impact in the world is being able to share in a storied form in a way that's accessible for the masses, not only for an academic audience, what it is that you've done. So if there's one absolute essential thing, it's to work on your writing, always work on your writing. And I feel myself, after 20 years of a career as a scholar, I'm still working on my writing. I'm still learning. I'm still developing and growing in that arena. Yeah, so that's an easy question.
Perfect. I'll pause it there. I do have probes, but I won't probe. I'll just move to the
Are you sure? This one I'd like to probe a little.
You want me to probe a
Yeah.
little? What I was going to probe on is that essentially it's an evolutionary process. It's not one day you're going to say, I have my writing skills, and that's the end of it. Like you've hit a peak in your writing in some capacity.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely true. It's an ongoing journey throughout your life, learning to refine your writing, learning to get clearer in your communications, recognizing which audience it is that you're speaking to. It's very different to speak to a group of scientists that are specialists in your field than it is to speak to service users in a particular context or practitioners who are working in a different context. So learning who it is that you're speaking to, thinking about your audience. And now there's so much more to learn about in terms of social media. How do we communicate using different types of social media? It's another specialty in and of itself. But definitely, I completely agree with you that it is a journey and something that we evolve into.
And also within that, writing itself doesn't mean just literally or physically the act of writing something. As you said, it's about tailoring your message. It's about editing your work. It's about revising the work. It's about coming in with a different perspective to make sure that what's being said is clear.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. And I think that's one of a very shocking thing to a junior researcher when you send back a first draft of a manuscript and there's 100 comments or 100 edits suggested, and you're also saying, this is excellent work, bravo, and here's a few suggestions to make it a little tighter or make it a little cleaner or get the message across a little more clearly. And I think it's a bit of a culture shock sometimes when people come in to do research and they get this feedback and they're like, oh, I'm doing horribly. And it's not that at all. It's you're doing great. You've got the foundations here. But how can we, turn that into a diamond? How can we really mine that beautiful message that's in this work? So that's something that I find sometimes, sometimes, rarely, maybe it will be up to 20 rounds of edits in a manuscript, but often easily 10 rounds. So that's an expectation for researchers or doctoral students coming in to know it's not a bad thing if you're getting all these edits. It's actually a really good thing that there's promise in this work to get it out into the world.
And there's someone that cares enough about the work to continue to do those rounds of edits with you or offer that feedback on that piece of work too.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So what are important or maybe unexpected skills that you think are important to develop as a researcher?
Well, research is maybe more of a social activity than people realize. So mostly social skills, communication skills, the ability to navigate conflict, deal with stress, work in teams, are all skills that you need in science and that are maybe not self-evident. Kind of imagining someone by themselves with their eureka moment in the lab. That's one thing. The other is just organizational skills. And I don't know if it's really the case that creative people are naturally disorganized, but the ability to kind of, because you're working in uncertain terrain, that's kind of the point to science. You don't know, you're wandering around kind of in areas where we don't fully understand things. And graduate school is also a kind of open-ended, poorly structured experience where in any given day you don't necessarily have anything specific to do unless you set yourself up to do it. So the ability to organize your own time and keep yourself on track to distant goals through trials and tribulations is definitely useful for graduate students and also useful as an investigator, because it's even arguably more the case as an investigator, like choosing what direction to go in and keeping yourself on track to get there is much more open-ended than many fields, which personally I think is a huge privilege, but it's also a big challenge.
It is that open-endedness, I think. It gives you a lot of opportunities to pursue different things or not use your time in ways that might not be effective.
Yeah, and even deciding what direction to go in can sort of paralyze people. If they don't have good judgment, good sense of what's likely to work over what time frame, then they can get into a lot of trouble. That's a place where junior faculty and students should definitely take advice because it is again something you're not really taught. So some people have like a natural feel for it and others don't, especially if you do experiments that take quite a long time or take a lot of resource. So you can't really afford to screw it up repeatedly. You'll run out of resource of one kind or another. So, yeah.
That's a great question. I'm not sure about necessary, but I have found that there are a couple of skills that unexpectedly prove to be quite helpful in research. One of them is writing. I've really found that being a good writer has helped in my own career. Now, this doesn't mean you need to write Shakespeare, but learning the ability to be able to write clearly in an accessible manner, in a way that people can really understand what you're trying to say, as opposed to the kind of thick, abstruse kind of text that we often think about and associate with academic prose. I have found that has been very helpful. So if you're able to take writing classes, or if you can learn to write in a way that people can understand what you mean and that you write clearly and accessibly, I have found that to be a very, very helpful skill. Because at the end of the day, you can have the best research in the world, you can have the best project in the world, and if you can't write it properly and you can't present it properly to somebody who reads it and understands what you're talking about, it's not going to go anywhere. And I guess that leads to the second skill that I have found is helpful, and that has to do a little bit with marketing, I guess. It's being able to pitch your ideas properly, which is also, it's a difficult and challenging skill for many people, but if you do have ideas and you are working on research, it's very helpful if you can learn how to pitch them quickly, succinctly, like we sometimes refer to it as the elevator pitch, right? So that if you're, if you need to be able to get your idea across from the 12th floor to the lobby in a way that attracts people and gets them interested in what you have to say. Because a lot of research is also marketing. It's an angle. It's how am I going to attract the attention of the right people to get this off the ground, to make people think that this is very important work that I'm doing, to convince them that it is, because it is very important work that you're doing. But how do I convince people of that? So those those have been unexpectedly important in my own career.
Mm-hmm. And they're so interrelated too.
Yes, they are.
Like so interrelated. So it makes me wonder, were there opportunities that you sought out to better these skill sets in any ways? Like I know you suggested maybe taking a writing course as an example. Have you ever done something like that to help with those skills?
I have. I've taken a number of writing classes, but that sort of predated a little bit my foray into research. But I can tell you that it has really helped. There is an amazing book by Steven Pinker called Sense of Style, which I recommend everybody get a hold of and read, because he's an example of an academic who writes in a very accessible way. And then in this book, he teaches people how to do the same. And so that's a little concrete bit of a little nugget for people to take home, a little pitch for Steven Pinker. Happens to be a Montreal scientist, by the way. But
really?
That's kind of aside the point, yeah.
Is there and I know I'm putting you on the spot with this, but is there a specific nugget that you could share or that you've taken away from that particular book?
It's sort of what I said already, which is that stuffy academic prose isn't necessarily the best prose. We're almost taught to write in a certain way that couches what we write. We think it lends a certain gravitas to it if we use big words, if we use the word utilize instead of the word use. But use is a perfectly acceptable word. And, if you're not able to get your point across and you get lost in the details because you're trying to impress somebody with your academic writing, then forget it. You're dead in the water. So I think that's been very helpful for me.
Definitely.
And as for marketing and pitch, I can't claim to be good at that even today. But I surround myself with people who are good at it, and I watch how they do it, and I'm eternally impressed with how good they are and articulate they are at communicating their ideas in short, succinct ways. So watch what they do and do that.
Is there anything that you've watched someone do that you've now kind of integrated in your way of doing these marketing pitches at all, or?
I guess it's just about, I think preparation can help. So you don't want to be caught on the spot with it. Just know that exists, the elevator pitch, or know that that's important, and maybe practice it a little bit, Make sure that this is something you can in fact train for relatively easily on your own. Make sure that you can get your idea across in 30 seconds or less.
Mm-hmm. I think these are other elements that we often assume about people as inherent traits in some capacity. Like, oh, that person's just such a good writer. Oh, that person's just so good at selling this idea about this thing, or so articulate in the way that they communicate about this thing. Not understanding or not knowing that oftentimes these are skills that can be developed over time.
100%. There are, of course, people have innate qualities and innate characteristics that make somebody naturally more predisposed to catching on to these things than others. But everyone can do it. And it may mean that somebody needs to take a little more time and requires a little more effort. But these are all trainable skills.
So this is a fun question, as you said. I think what comes to mind right away is your coping skills. I think in the world of research, there are many ups and downs, successes and failures. And I think you have to have really good coping mechanisms to manage all the sort of the emotions that come out of that. And I think a positive outlook is helpful in that sense, to know that, at some point your paper will probably get published. It may take several, renditions of that, right? And if it doesn't, well, then you have to ask yourself, is there something that you can salvage from this? Can it be presented differently? How else could you disseminate that information, right? Because it goes back to that. If it's for, the metrics of getting promoted and tenure, well, that's really unfortunate. But if it is for just disseminating the findings because that's important to you, then there are other ways of doing that. So I think your coping mechanisms are helpful. Your positive outlook is helpful to be able to help you to sort of identify the steps, achieve your goals, and at the same time manage all the emotions that come with the ups and downs.
That's a really good insight because I was expecting, I feel like I take this for granted. And whenever I ask this question, I assume that people are going to be like, well, your writing skills need to be really great, right? Like those kinds of things, not like you need to be able to cope with rejection sometimes.
Well, absolutely, because I think that was one of my challenges during this whole process was I remember the first time one of my papers, it wasn't related to my doctoral research. It was a paper I had gotten published or had done the research just before I started the PhD program. And it was heartbreaking to have that rejection. And, and on top of that, it was from an expert in the area that I did the research in. So I was just like flabbergasted. It took me weeks to sort of say, okay, I've done my morning now. We got to move on, right? What are the pearls of knowledge or information I can learn from this? What can I take and then put into this paper, make it better so I can resubmit it? Yeah. And so knowing that, I had to put an end to the morning and that I had to move on was really helpful. And having support to sort of say, this is part of the process, this is part of the learning. And I felt I really grew from that experience.
That makes me want to jump to one of the bonus questions that we have that I sent you. And so I will ask the one bonus question. How do you handle rejection?
So I've learned over time to compartmentalize it. I think that also comes from my experience as an occupational therapist, as a healthcare provider. So after that initial rejection, of course, I've had other rejections. And so what I've done is that when that happens, I take the 2-3 days to mourn, and I think that's part of that process. But you also want to open that email and read it in depth when you're ready to look at it. So there's the, oh my God, it's been rejected. You cry, you get upset. You eat ice cream if that helps you. And then after that, you say, okay, by Monday, we need to move on. And we need to start to think about next steps. And so putting a sort of a boundaries around that mourning period, I think is helpful. And thinking about what's the next steps. So you're solution oriented and you're always sort of thinking ahead is helpful. Yeah.
So Terkuma, what did you think about what our 5 had to say?
Yeah, it was a very interesting discussion because from my understanding, the major skills required are communication skills, social skills, maybe coping skills. I categorize it into 3. Communication, that will involve the listening. It will also involve the writing and the marketing or the elevator pitch thing. So all of those are communication. You have to either communicate by speaking or by writing. And then with all of this, I discover that there are things you don't just do it as once off. You continue to refine them. For instance, you will assume that decades ago there were people who were professors who were proficient in writing articles and all of that. But today we have social media, so they still have to learn how to write on social media and communicate there to their audience. So it's something that you keep doing. And then you also have the coping skills. For everybody who submits a paper or even interacts with their supervisors, there's always feedback. Sometimes feedback is not the best thing to get. And of course, sometimes you may have people who are not very good at giving feedback. So if you are not able to cope with that, to manage that, you might be discouraged and even walk away from what you're supposed to be doing because you feel discouraged. And then there's obviously stress involved. You have a lot of things that are competing for your attention. That's where the organizational skills come in. You're able to prioritize and to move according to what you're supposed to do. So then social, you wouldn't think that research is anything social because you just get into the lab or collect your data and all of that. But in doing that research, whether you are doing actual bench work or you are doing field work, you're interacting with participants or you're interacting with team members and sometimes even ethical review boards and sometimes policymakers and things like that. So you need the skill to be able to manage all of these relationships, because certainly you are going to have disappointments, because human beings, intentionally or unintentionally, sometimes are not able to meet up with the commitments they have made. So if you are not able to deal with all of that, that is that. Ordinarily, you will feel these are not important for research. In research, you want to have your protocols written correctly. You have to do what you have to do to get your results, but it's beyond that. Yeah.
Definitely. I want to follow up with one question for you, and that is, were there any skills you were expecting R5 to say that they didn't end up saying?
Not really. I would have expected something to be said about when you have relating with a supervisor or a mentor as a junior researcher. But of course, that is covered in the social nature of social skills that one needs to have. So I think that was properly covered in that.
Yeah, the social, the emotional.
Yeah, emotional. Yeah, I forgot that. Yeah.
Right? And that's all part of the coping piece there, that you need to have. Maybe it's a level of emotional intelligence in some capacity, or maybe it is just emotional skills in some way to kind of separate the personal from the professional, or what's actually about you versus what's actually about the work, so that you don't take rejection or feedback negatively or as a remark about your own character.
Exactly.
No, I agree with these insights 100%. And the last one, the communication skills. I like that you brought up that there's an evolution in these communication skills that's happening, where before it was just writing a paper, but now you're writing a paper and maybe posting about it on social media, or maybe you're recording a podcast or something else. It's all an evolution of those skills that keep moving.
And it's all geared towards making your work accessible to all constituencies. You have people in your field, you have the public, you have end users or whatever you are doing. So for your research to be successful, it needs to be shared with all the people that it impacts one way or another. So that's important.
Oh, definitely. Taking into account that you're not just doing the research for other researchers or clinicians, but everybody should be able to gain some level of knowledge or understanding from the work that you're doing.
That's right.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Well, Terkuma, I want to thank you for joining me on the podcast today and being willing to share your insights with me. It's been really great to chat with you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And for everyone else that's watching or listening to the podcast, thank you so much for tuning in, and we hope you'll join us to Ask 5. This is all going to get used in some capacity.
Stop moving.
Just shut up and stop moving, Meredith. Honestly, I'm on it.
As soon as you told me something that falls from the sky, and I'm like, wow, I probably want this to be pleasant.
That's really nice. My answer to that, as I was thinking about it, was nowhere near as elegant or as beautiful as your answer. I was like, I want hunks of Parmesan falling from the sky. And you feel okay with having a microchip put in your brain? Like someone actually surgically...
Yeah, I guess I wouldn't be the only one in the universe, right? If that's a possibility. So, I mean...
Just not the first person to do
maybe,
it.
yeah.
As long as you're later down the line, they've gotten more experience.
If it works for somebody, it should work for me as well.
Right.
I don't know.
Do you want to take a pause? And take a quick pause and then jump back into it.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully you're getting enough good clips.
We are.
There,
Do not worry.
You're not, obviously you're going to wade through the stammering and all that, but.
We're only going to talk about rejection and failure now. So this is the fun part of the podcast.
Oh, Elizabeth's going to check my accuracy of the use of the word idiom.
We're going to do some Googling.
Thanks, guys.
Woo!